was a small, nameless village tucked away in the Anatolian wilderness, where time seemed to stand still. The villagers followed traditions older than memory, whispering ancient prayers to unseen forces. Their fields were bountiful, their livestock healthy, but there was always an unspoken rule: never disturb the black soil beneath the old sycamore tree at the village's edge. Dr. Alexander Carter, an ethnographer specializing in rural folklore, arrived in the village with his assistant, Emily Hayes. They had heard rumors, stories of unexplainable deaths, people vanishing without a trace, and an eerie presence lurking in the fields at night. Alexander had spent years chasing such legends, but none had ever led to anything more than superstition. The villagers welcomed them with wary eyes. They were given lodging in the home of an elder named Hamza, whose wrinkles held decades of buried secrets. On the first night, as they dined on lentil soup and fresh bread, Alexander cautiously broached the topic of the sycamore tree. Hamza's grip tightened around his spoon. "That land is cursed," he muttered. "Something was buried there long ago, something that should never be unearthed." Emily, intrigued, pressed further. "Buried by whom?" Hamza glanced around, lowering his voice. "By those who tried to rid the village of the demon seed." Ignoring the elder's warning, Alexander and Emily ventured to the tree the next day. The ground beneath it was unusually dark, as though the soil had been scorched. A strange buzzing filled the air, an almost imperceptible hum that set their teeth on edge. "Do you feel that?" Emily whispered. Alexander nodded. His hands trembled as he brushed aside the fallen leaves, revealing what looked like an old, rusted amulet embedded in the dirt. The moment his fingers grazed the metal, a deafening screech filled the air, and the sky darkened unnaturally fast. The wind howled through the trees like a chorus of tormented souls. That night, the first nightmare came. Emily woke screaming, her body drenched in sweat. "I saw it," she gasped, clutching at her throat. A woman, her skin rotting, her mouth filled with blackened teeth. She was watching me. Alexander, trying to shake the fear creeping up his spine, dismissed it as exhaustion. But as the nights passed, the dreams worsened. Shadows moved in corners where none should be. The whispers of a long-dead voice called their names. The air in their room grew thick with an unbearable stench of decay. They began noticing other strange occurrences. Their belongings would shift inexplicably, rearranged by unseen hands. Doors would creak open in the dead of night, revealing nothing but oppressive darkness beyond. The village's livestock started to die, their corpses left untouched, yet their eyes were always missing. Then came the voices. At first, they were faint, a whisper behind the ear, a barely audible murmur when the wind passed through the trees. But soon, they became distinct. They called out in a language neither of them understood, yet the words slithered into their minds, filling them with a sense of unbearable dread. One night, Alexander woke to find Emily gone. He stumbled through the dark, calling her name, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. He found her standing in the courtyard, staring at the tree, her lips moving rapidly in a silent chant. When he touched her shoulder, she turned, and for a split second, her eyes were not her own, they were hollow pits of endless blackness. By the fifth day, Emily was barely recognizable. Deep circles darkened her eyes, and her skin had taken on an almost sickly pallor. The villagers avoided them now, their gazes filled with silent horror. Only Hamza dared approach. "You have angered it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The seed has been disturbed." Alexander finally gave in to his growing dread. "Tell me what it is." Hamza sighed. "Centuries ago, a woman came to this village, claiming to possess knowledge of the old gods. She was a seer, they said, but her visions brought only madness. She spoke of a being older than time, a creature that would be born from the earth itself if the right ritual was performed. The villagers, terrified of her power, executed her, burning her body under that very tree. But before she died, she cursed the land. She said that one day, the seed of the demon she carried within her would awaken. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. And now, Hamza's eyes darkened. Now, it knows you. That night, the horror began in earnest. The house trembled as though an unseen force was shaking its very foundation. The lanterns flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The whispers were no longer distant, they surrounded them, pressing against their skulls like clawed fingers. Emily stood motionless before the window, her breath fogging up the glass despite the warmth of the room. Her lips moved soundlessly. Alexander's pulse quickened. Emily? She turned, and his stomach lurched. Her eyes were black, voids of endless darkness. A guttural voice, not her own, slithered from her lips. It is awake. Then, the room erupted into chaos. The walls cracked, thick, dark rivulets oozing from the fissures like blood from a wound. The whispers turned into agonized screams. An unseen force slammed into Alexander, throwing him against the far wall. He barely registered the pain as he saw Emily levitating above the floor, her limbs bent at unnatural angles. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the lanterns, plunging the room into near-total darkness. Something vast, moved in the shadows, its presence suffocating. The temperature plummeted. Alexander's breath came in ragged gasps as he reached for the amulet. Hamza burst into the room, his voice rising in a desperate chant. The unseen force fought back, resisting his words. Emily let out an inhuman wail, her body convulsing violently. The house groaned, as if it were alive, as if it, too, was being torn apart by the entity's fury. Alexander forced himself forward, crawling across the splintered wooden floor. His fingers found the amulet. A sudden wave of heat surged through his body, and for a brief moment, he saw it, the true form of the entity. Towering, eyeless, its mouth a gaping chasm filled with writhing, whispering tongues. Its skeletal fingers reached for him. With the last of his strength, he plunged the amulet into the earth. The ground shuddered. The screams crescendoed into an ear-splitting wail as the entity was dragged back into the abyss. The shadows recoiled. The walls stopped bleeding. Emily collapsed to the floor, motionless. Morning came, but nothing was the same. The house, once filled with warmth, now felt cold and lifeless. Emily lay unconscious, her body frail and drained. The air was thick with something unspoken, an echo of something unfinished. The symbols on Alexander's skin continued to spread, forming intricate patterns that pulsed with an unnatural energy. And the voices, they had not stopped. Every night, they grew louder, promising that the seed was not destroyed, only waiting. Then, one night, Emily vanished. Alexander searched frantically, but there was no trace of her. Then, from the darkness of his own reflection in the mirror, she spoke. Return. He had never left. The seed had already claimed him,